Speech and language are actually two different things. Language is a whole system of words and symbols that people use to communicate meaning. Speech is the sound of language. Each of these areas have some sub-areas, subcategories. Language consists of receptive language, expressive language, and pragmatics. All of those interact and are connected. Linda and I will be talking about each of these areas of language, what you look for when you're thinking about those areas, and some ways that you, as parent partners, can support a child's development of language. Speech, as I said before, is the sound of language. When you're thinking of speech, you're looking at a child's articulation, their fluency, their rate of speech, their voice quality, and the overall ability to understand what the child is saying. Talking about rhyming today, and the hierarchy of development of rhyming, and different ways to present it dependent upon the level that the child is at. We'll be introducing the pacing board and how you may be able to use it in your lesson to help improve a child's speech, maybe their understanding of multisyllable words, and maybe even how to break words apart with using it. Today we'll be showing you some ways to use manipulatives in your lesson to make your lesson more effective and to keep the child more engaged, and also ways to enrich their vocabulary by using those manipulatives. I'd like to start with an overview of speech and language. Obviously, speech and language is what you use to communicate. However, they are two different areas of communication. Language is what you use to be able to take in information and process information that you've heard or read and attach a meaning to it. That's receptive language, basically your listening skills. To share information, you put words into sentences to share your thoughts and ideas. That's expressive language. Language is also what you use to engage in social interactions with people, and that's called pragmatics. All three of those language areas interact and are connected. And language is the foundation upon which children build all their learning. If they have a weak language base and you start introducing new information, they're going to have trouble holding on to it because they have nothing to attach it to. Speech, however, is the sound of language. How do you sound when you talk? Do you have good articulation skills? Do you produce speech sounds correctly in words? Do you speak fluently, or do you have a lot of hesitations and stuttering moments in your speech? What is your rate of speech? Do you talk too fast or too slow? It's your voice quality. Does your voice sound harsh, nasal, hoarse? It's your overall intelligibility. Can people understand you when you're talking? And it also includes phonology, which is the relating of sounds within the words. So both of those areas are very different. And I like to think of them in this example. Picture yourself all of a sudden being picked up and put in a group of non-English speaking people. They all speak Japanese and do not speak English, and you do not speak Japanese. Your language skills would be impaired. You would not be able to listen and process what they say to you. You wouldn't be able to share your thoughts with them, and you would also not be able to establish a social interaction. Speech, however, I would think of as if you are an actor and you're an English-speaking person, you're an American, but you're being asked to play a British person in a movie, you would have to adjust some of your articulation. You think about Mary, her articulation is different. Though she's from the East Coast, so her R's sound a little bit different. I worked with a teacher that was from Massachusetts, and she didn't have her R's the same way we did. And whenever she'd say the word orange, she'd say orange. So she asked me to work with her a little bit because a lot of her students tried to imitate the way she said orange. So when you think of language and speech, a child can have poor language skills but have good speech skills. They can have poor speech skills, but have good language skills, or they can be impaired in both areas. So Linda and I, through our day this morning, we're going to talk about each of these areas and how they relate to your Spark lesson. So I'm going to start with receptive language. And as I had mentioned, it's your listening skills, your ability to take in what you hear
attach a meaning to it, and then follow through with what was said to you. Receptive language includes the ability to answer questions, follow directions, and show understanding of a variety of concepts and vocabulary. When I think of receptive language, I think back to a student, Laura Umpendorfer from the Maslin Spark. Might remember this little boy. The mom brought him in for an evaluation at the school, and she shared the fact that she thought her child had a lot of behavior issues. She said he would not do what she told him to do. When she'd talk with him, he'd give silly answers. She gave the example of she had asked him to put his shoes under his bed, and instead he sat on the bed. So she was extremely worried about his behavior. Well, when I went to do the evaluation with him, I found out it wasn't behavior. He was actually a well-behaved little boy, but his receptive skills were extremely impaired. So when she gave him directions, he couldn't follow them. He could only hold on to the very last word in the direction she gave. He couldn't answer questions. Like when she'd ask him a why question, he had no idea. He couldn't answer even the most basic questions. So he would be an example of a child with a receptive language problem that actually appeared to have behavior issues. So I'd like to talk about answering questions when you ask a child to answer questions. And think about your Spark lessons. You are frequently asking them questions because you want to see if they're comprehending what you're sharing and beginning to process the information you're sharing. But there are some things you want to think about when you think about questions. First of all, you want to think about the developmental order. Children learn to process questions in a developmental order. They start out with yes/no questions, simple little questions like, do you want more milk? Do you want to go outside? They also begin to process what questions. And if you think about yourself engaging with a little one, you ask a lot of what questions. What is that? You point things out. Then children begin to learn the where and the who questions. They start to process where means give an answer for with a location. Then the who questions, they have to answer with a person. And then the later developing questions are the when, how, and why. So when you're working with a child who is lower than what's expected for a child that age, you might want to think about not bombarding them with those later developing questions. You're asking a lot of that lower child to be able to answer the when, how, and why. You might want to consider to keep your questions more with the earlier developing questions. Another thing to consider with answering questions is whether your question is concrete or abstract. Concrete means it's right in front of you. The answer is right there. If you think of the word apple. If I have an apple here, that's concrete. If I show a picture of an apple, that's a little less concrete and a little more abstract. But if I show the word apple, that's the most abstract. So questions like if you were using a color of his own, and you have this picture in front of the child, and you say, what animal is that? That's concrete. But if you said to the child, what would the chameleon have to do to turn black and white? That is an abstract question. There is nothing in front of them to find that answer. They have to use mental imagery. They have to picture in their mind what would need to happen for the chameleon to be black and white. And the other thing to consider is whether your question is open-ended or closed-ended. Closed-ended questions are questions that you reply with a yes, no, or a 1 to 2 word response. Open-ended questions require a wider range of answers and a longer answer. So if you were to say, what was the book about? The child would say chameleon, 1 word response. If you ask, was the chameleon happy at the end of the story? A closed-ended question, your answer is yes. But if you ask the child, what makes you happy? That's an open-ended question. There's a lot of responses that would still be correct, but you have 4 children, you might have 4 different answers. So, just like a scaffold supports a building, here's a way to support a child's ability to answer questions. These are some different methods that you could use when you're asking questions to help the child respond in an appropriate way. These ideas start with the most or least help and progress on down to the most help. So the first example is ask the question and emphasize key words. So if your question was, how did the chameleon feel at the end of the story? You would ask, how did the chameleon feel at the end of the story? You're emphasizing the key words that the child needs to process to answer that question correctly. You might want to ask the question and give a starter cue. How did the chameleon feel at the end of the story? He felt, and let the child finish that sentence. You could ask the question with choices for answers. So you would say, did the chameleon feel happy or sad at the end of the story? You could ask the question, give the answer, and then re-ask the question. How did the chameleon feel at the end of the story? He felt happy. How did he feel? And then see if the child could repeat it back. Or you could ask the question and then give the answer and move on. A note for you just to keep in mind, if you do have a lot of children with autism that you're working with, questions are extremely difficult for them. And sometimes it's easier for them to answer a question if you give it in a direction form. So you say, tell me how the chameleon felt at the end of the story. Number 3, asking the question with choices for answers. I use that one the most when I'm trying to help a child who struggles with questions. By giving choices, you're narrowing the field of possibility of answers. So the child that answers with an inappropriate answer, if you ask, how did the chameleon feel at the end of the story, and he says green, he's not processing that word feel. But if you give him the choices, did he feel sad or happy, now you're attaching the appropriate type of words you need for that question. So, following directions. It requires an ability to retain and process information, so you got to hold on to what you've been told, and it also requires a strong knowledge of basic concepts and vocabulary. We'll talk a little bit about basic concepts in a moment. When giving directions, you want to consider the number of steps in your given direction and the complexity of the concepts in your direction. So, for example, if you tell a child to stand up, that's a one-step direction. Write your name, one step. Trace the letter, one step. But if you tell the child, write your name and then draw a picture, that's a two-step direction. If the direction has that word and in it, you know right away it's a two-step direction. Complexity of the concepts in the given direction. A lot of times, the child doesn't really have an issue with following directions. He just doesn't understand the vocabulary in the direction. So if you were to say to the child, put the chameleons on the leaf, as compared to put the chameleons between the leaves, they're going to process on much easier than between, because between is a later developing concept word. Using words above and below as compared to over and under. Over and under are learned before above and below. So you do want to consider that they're not struggling with the steps of the direction or the direction, it's the vocabulary in your direction. This slide here talks about basic concepts. Those words appear throughout a child's day. In the academic setting, it appears in phys ed, because they'll hear a word like go stand between Susie and Johnny, or stand at the end of the line, or stand first, or wait your turn. Those are all kinds of concept words. Those words appear throughout their home day and in social interactions, and they're extremely needed for a child to be successful in the school setting. Some types of basic concept words are your colors, spatial words like the between, the in, on, under, top, bottom, shape words, quantity, more, less, many, few, none, size, big, small, feeling, sad, happy, time words, before, after, Descriptive words like same, different, new, old. And sequential words like first, next, last. And I'm sure as I'm saying some of those, you're thinking of some of the words that you use in your lessons. You're using a lot of those concept words. And a child that is struggling with their language skills, they're going to fall apart with some of the more advanced concepts. In your handout, there is a paper that talks a little further about basic concepts and different ways of following directions. You can take a look at that at your leisure. So just as I said about scaffolding for questions, there's also a scaffold for following directions. How can you help a child be successful at following directions? So one of the activities you do is in that to market grocery ad, you have the child go through and find different things. That's an excellent activity where you can incorporate some two-step directions with a more advanced child, and also a way to give a one-step direction for a child that's only at that level. And I think I forgot to add, the children that you're working with, the 4.5 to 5-year-old children, should be able to follow a 2 to 3-step direction. So when you think about the children you're working with and they're only following a one-step direction, that's kind of a little bit of a red flag. So I'm going to give the example of, you say to the child, find the number 5 on that ad and circle it. Of course, that's a, how many step direction? 2. So when you're giving that direction, obviously you want to make sure you have the child's attention. But if they're struggling with directions, you restate your direction and emphasize the key words. So you say, find the number 5 and circle it. Give a shorter direction. You could just say, circle the number 5. You could rephrase the direction and make it simpler. Where's 5? Circle it. Break the direction apart into steps. Find the number 5. The child finds it. Circle it. So you broke it apart. Give a visual support. So you're going to point out the 5 and make that circle motion with your finger so they know to circle it. And the last one would be to model the direction. So you would find a 5 yourself, circle it, and say, oh, I found the number 5. Now it's your turn. So you're modeling it. So those are some different ways to help support following directions. And maybe you're doing a lot of those already. I hope so.